Well, I was born in Ashland, Kentucky in 1936, and my father was a Baptist minister, a Southern Baptist minister before they went conservative. Anyway, but they moved to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where he was pastor of the First Baptist Church. So I basically grew up at home and in the church because I had to go to church every time the doors opened. And I also had 3 older brothers who were very mean to me. I mean, we're friends now. When they got older, they weren't so mean, but when I was a kid, they picked on me and hit me, and it was like I was excluded from everything they did. And that was a gift because I realized what it was like to be an underdog. And I always, kind of identified with the underdog. So I thank my mean brothers. And let's see. Of course, at church, I heard all the Bible stories, and we talked about Jesus a lot and memorized the Bible verses and everything. So that's my childhood, kind of. And then in high school, I was in the last segregated high school class, which was 1954, class of 54. And I took 4 years of Latin. And so in the last year, the 4th year, the teacher was talking about the mythology of the Romans. And we had all those great stories of the myths. And one of the stories was about Leda and the swan, where Leda claimed that this god, Jupiter, became a swan, and they had sex, and then she had a baby that was half man and half God. And the teacher said it wasn't all that uncommon for young women to claim that the father of their child was a god back then. And so this big light bulb went on over my head, and it was like I realized that the whole foundation of the church was a fraud kind of thing. And I didn't talk about this at home, but it was like a big revelation to me that this whole institution that defended all the society as it was a fraud. So that was a big revelation. And then I went to Wake Forest College when it was a college, and I had some teachers that were very good, a history professor in particular. But I really wanted to get away from home, so I got married too early and had kids and everything. So, well, everything was segregated, and we had this maid who came to help my mother, and when I was a little girl, we used to drive her home, and her home was in the black section, and the pavement stopped when we got to her neighborhood, and there was no pavement. And then inside her house was very clean, but she had kerosene lamps, and she had an outhouse. So I asked my mother, why did the pavement stop, and why doesn't she have electricity and things? And I don't know exactly what she said. That's just the way it is. But it didn't seem fair to me. And because of the gift of my brothers, it bothered me a great deal.
And did you ever cross the color line when you were young? Did you have African American
It didn't
playmates
seem
or
to be any
anything like that?
opportunity in Winston-Salem to do that. It was like that world and our world. It was. You're talking about the early 50s. I do remember a strike in Winston-Salem at Reynolds Tobacco Company, and there were African-American men carrying picket signs that said, "I'd walk a mile for camel, now let camel walk a mile for me." And that was something that's impressed on me.
So you mentioned going to Wake Forest,
Right.
and that you had some professors there that you found interesting. What was interesting about them?
The main thing this history professor did was question everything and say, how do you know that's true? That kind of thing. Critical, first introduction to critical thinking, because everybody else was just like, this is the way it is, you know. And it never occurred to me that things could change, or I could help change things. So.
And so you graduate from college?
No, I didn't. I got married after 1 year.
Okay.
I got married, and we moved to Baltimore. And my husband was in the Army.
Okay.
So that was, I guess, in the late 50s. And so when he got out of the Army, he decided to go to medical school. And I said, well, if you're going, go to a city where I can get an interesting job. So he went to GW in Washington. And that's when I started working for Drew Pearson.
Okay. Who was Drew Pearson?
Oh, he was a newspaper columnist, a muckraker. He was proud to be in that school of journalism. And he had friends all over the Hill and in the White House. So it was like having a behind-the-scenes look at the power structure of Washington.
And what did you, was this when you went to work for him,
Mm-hmm.
was this a whole new world for you?
Yes, it was a whole new world.
And can you talk about that?
Well, it was just like
world that you entered into.
A big revelation. And I had 2 jobs. One was to open the fan mail, which was a big pile, and then answer some letters and write other letters for him to sign, and also to send out his column on the teletype and type up his journal that he kept. So it was like the inside story of what was going on from his perspective.
Mm-hmm. And do you remember what year you began to work for him?
It would have been 1960 or 61, around then.
And did you travel much?
No, I didn't. I was just in the office doing my job.
You find yourself at the 1964 Democratic Convention.
Right.
This appears to be a major turning point for you.
It is.
How did you get to the convention? What happened there to make it so important to you? And then how did that convention navigate the next chapter of your life?
Well, I went with Mrs. Pearson, Drew Pearson, and Jack Anderson, who was a reporter from him. Do you know? So what I had been trying to get Mr. Pearson to write about all summer was what was happening in Mississippi, because the summer of '64 had begun, and I was just really in love with what the black people were doing in Mississippi. It was like I couldn't wait to get the Snick press releases. It was my job to open the mail, right? And so I read them all, and I was trying to get him to write about this, and he wouldn't do it. You know, he would call up his friends and ask them what happened, and not what I was telling him from Snick. And so, but occasionally there would be something. If a church got burned down, he would write about that. And there was a mailman who was walking to Mississippi, and I can't remember his name. Do you remember his name? And he was killed on the side of the road. And he had written to Mr. Pearson about his going, and I saved the letter and I showed it to him. So he wrote about that assassination and a few things. So he was in the Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey wing of the Democratic Party, not the Kennedy wing. And I kind of admired the Kennedys, but anyway, so that's kind of what I did there. And I went to the convention, and I kept bugging him because I after work I would go out and there would be these sit-ins on the boardwalk, and I just thought that was wonderful. And I'd go and sit down and everything, and I'd come back and say, they're doing this and that. Why aren't you writing about it? And so one day he said, well, if you're so interested in this, you go out and interview some of them and write it up, and I'll run it in my column. And I said, okay. So I went out and I went to the Gym Hotel where the Mississippi people were staying, and I met some of them, and Mr. Steptoe came up to me and he asked me if I had had enough to eat that day. And I said, yes, thank you. And then I stopped and I realized why he was asking me that question. And it was because some of the people there had not had enough to eat. And it was like, oh my goodness, here I am with this good job and everything and house, and these people hadn't had enough to eat. It was like, what am I doing? What am I doing with my life? And so it was like I knew right then that I had to change. And I met this guy named Jack Menace, and we talked a lot. He explained how the relationship of racism and capitalism, and how it helped the ruling class to have people fighting, that they could control people better. I'd never thought about that, but I learned a lot from Jack. And so I went home and quit my job, and Jack said that I should come to Mississippi now. So that's what I did. He said, in a few years, you won't be able to come. And I wasn't sure what he was talking about, but I said, well, okay, I don't know what's going to happen in a few years, so I'll go now. So I made all these arrangements and went down to Jackson and went to the COFO office, which is the Council of Federated Organizations. And I met Jesse Morris and other people in the office, and they wanted me to go to Batesville, Mississippi, which I did. And I stayed there for a while. But then they were do you understand about the congressional challenge? At the convention was a challenge to the Democratic Party.
Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Well, in 1963, I guess, the leaders of SNCC and some lawyers who were National Lawyers Guild lawyers met to decide how to move things faster. So one of the ways they did that was to concentrate on Mississippi. And they knew that people couldn't vote and couldn't be members, black people couldn't vote or be members of the Democratic Party. So they set up an alternative party called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So in 1963 or 64, they had a vote for Congress and Senate and local leaders on the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party ticket. So, you know, when people went to the regular Democratic Party to try to go to precinct meetings, they would say, oh, that meeting happened last week, or you can't come in. And then it was kind of like going to register to vote. Afterwards, they would get their car insurance canceled, or they'd get fired, or their home shot into. So it was a very dangerous situation. So the challenge at Atlantic City was the seating of the regular Democrats, Eastland and Jamie Whitten and those racist people in Congress. So they brought their own delegates to the convention and said, we are the real Democrats because we let everybody in and we followed the rules of the formation of a Democratic Party, and here we are. And at the convention, eventually, of course, now when that happened, Pearson would call Hubert Humphrey to see what the deal was. But Jack Minnis had got me into the hearing of the Credentials Committee when Fannie Lou Hamer testified. And she gave scathing testimony. I assume you've seen it. And that was another thing that really affected me at the convention. The Mississippi people were offered a compromise. And Joe Rao and Martin Luther King and the leaders of the old movement came to the Mississippi people and said, we will allow you 2 seats in the convention. And so they took a vote, and Miss Hamer said, we didn't come all this way for no 2 seats. So they rejected the compromise. So then all of these people got on their buses and went back home. And that's where I arrived in Mississippi with them.
So Miss Hamer's testimony was
it was life-changing testimony.
Do you believe that other people, perhaps in your position, people who had watched things develop over time or had taken more than maybe just a little casual interest in the movement, do you think you were alone after hearing Miss Hamer's testimony and then saying to yourself, all right, I got to do something. I may not know what that is, but I got to do something. What was it like to listen to Fannie Lou Hamer?
Well, it was transfixing. And I look back on my life that I hadn't done shit for these people, and so I just decided I would change.
So you go to Mississippi after the 1964 Democratic Convention.
Right.
What was it like for you, living and working among the local community?
Well, when I got to Batesville, I stayed with the family in a house that didn't have, I think they had electricity, but they didn't have running water. So there was an outhouse, and I went outside and saw these kids, and they had sores on their legs, running sores coming. They all had that, and it was like, my goodness, what is going on? Why is that? Because I had never seen people like that with the sores running, fluid coming out. So then the other people told me, well, that's because they don't have a bathroom to wash in. So that was like, this is awful that people have to live. It was like a whole new world to me. So I just observed and tried to take in as much as possible. The family made me sleep in the back room behind the chimney in case the house got shot into, because it was very dangerous for them to have white people in their house living with them. And the other thing I noticed is that when I went to do the laundry at the laundromat, there were these white women coming in to do their laundry. And it was, and I said hello, you know, it was like, but then I asked some of my friends, why are white women coming to do their laundry here? And they said, well, they think that washing machines over here will get their clothes cleaner than the ones in the white, because they had used to have laundress come to do their laundry who were African American, so they thought, well, their washing machines would be better. It was really crazy. Well, after the convention, the movement decided that we would support Lyndon Johnson, that he was better than Goldwater. So there were no signs or anything for Lyndon Johnson in Mississippi. So one night we decided to go to Memphis to get to their Democratic Party headquarters to get some signs. So we did and came back, and another guy and I can't remember his name, it just went out of my head, but we went into the white section and asked people. I asked this lady if she would like to put Lyndon Johnson's picture in her window, and she said, no, we don't put pictures of communists in our window. And I said, well, all right. And then I left. It was kind of scary, that the hate and hostility was just overwhelming. But
was the hate and hostility that you encountered in Mississippi a different kind of hate and hostility that you knew growing up in North Carolina?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
What were some of the differences between the world of Jim Crow in North Carolina and then what you saw?
Well, back then I was not aware, so I can't really say what the differences were, but it was very, very bad. It was really hatred in Mississippi. It was dangerous to walk down the street. So that was the main thing. And we had a little potluck supper, and another guy from Snick came over to me and said, "Are you scared?" And I said, yes. And he said, you better be scared, because that will save your life. So that was the kind of fear that we all had. We never knew from one day to the next whether we would be alive. And of course, this was after the 3 volunteers had gotten lynched and other people had gotten lynched. And we knew about churches burning down, and Jimmy Travis had been shot in the neck driving out of from a meeting, and it was all very real. It was a war situation that you never knew who was going to be next. Maybe you would be next.
And so you lived in fear.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And that helped concentrate the mind in a certain way?
Certain way, yeah. And then the congressional challenge was when the Mrs. Hamer and Miss Devine and Victoria Gray and others went to Washington to challenge the seating on the House and Senate floor at the Capitol building. So in preparation for that, I worked. I did some work, which was to collect all the affidavits that had been given in 1964 about how people could not enter black people could not enter the Democratic Party, were excluded. So I had to drive around to different projects in the state. I had a car. I went by myself because I had a Southern accent and I could talk Southern if the police stopped me. And so that's what I did. I drove around the state from different projects and got all those papers in my car and took them to Jackson. And then they asked me to work in the Washington office in D.C., which I did for about 6 weeks leading up to that challenge. That was pretty hard work in that office. Mike Thelwell was in charge of the office. Well, I worked in the MFDP office in Washington. And, we would have meetings, and the night before the challenge, in other words, the night before Congress was back in session, we were meeting in the office, and a delegation came from Congress to talk to Mrs. Hamer and Miss Devine and Victoria Gray, and it was led by John Conyers. And he asked them not to chain themselves to the door of Congress. And we had never thought to do that. It was a wonderful idea. We didn't do it, but it was like Conyers had this fantasy that we were going to do that, but we didn't do that. But we did have people from Mississippi lining the tunnel from the House office building to the Capitol, where they would go to vote, and they just stood there, all these poor African-American Mississippi sharecroppers standing on either side, and these people had to walk through that gauntlet. The congressman had to walk through that gauntlet to get to the floor of the House. So that was very dramatic. After that, I went to work in the Snick office in Atlanta.
And what year was this? Was it still
that would have been
1964?
the January of early February of 1965.
What was it like to walk into the headquarters of SNCC with all these people that were,
It was good. I was very much aware that I was not in charge, that African American leadership was in charge, and I was just learned from them what to do. So Jack Minnis worked in the office, so I had known him before.
And what exactly did Jack do? You've mentioned him, but what was Jack's?
Jack was the research director of SNCC. So he was the one who got the demographic information for every project in Mississippi and Alabama, and gave that to the organizers before they even went to town, so they knew who the officials were, what the industry was, what the employment was, the unemployment, the churches. They knew everything about a town before they went into it. They didn't have to find all of that out. And so that was his job, and other things he did too, like he understood about he saw patterns in the way the capitalist system worked, and he understood about interlocking boards of directors of corporations who had invested in Mississippi and how they control the government. So that was a very important thing, and he sent out a newsletter about that. When he gave the demographic information, he also gave who was on the board of directors and what other companies they were dealing with. It went much deeper than just the population. So Jack did that kind of work. So
And
what
it
else?
sounds as if it was very important work.
It was important, and he did such a good job.
Would you consider the kind of work that Jack Minnis did in those days to be somewhat innovative and groundbreaking, kind of ahead of the curve of, if we look now at how sophisticated the analysis is of voting patterns and where people live,
Right.
and how to target them for good or bad?
Right.
Is that something Jack Minnis was doing
In
50 years ago?
1964 and 65, yeah. But he didn't have a computer or internet, so he had Standard and Poor's and Moody's and all of these reference books, and he knew right where to look at each one of them, and he taught people how to do that. He taught organizers, look it up in Standard and Poor, look it up in Martindale Hubble, see where that guy went to school, and get the background information so you know what you're dealing with. You don't just go in cold. Well, Ruby Doris Robinson and Cheselonia Johnson, Ruth Howard and James Bond, and Wilson Brown, who was a printer. And then there were always people coming through, staff people coming through the office. And I remember one time Stokely Carmichael came in. And part of my job was work with the Medical Committee for Human Rights and arrange doctor's appointments for people that needed to be seen by a doctor. And one day Stokely comes in, and he wanted to know where the medical committee was. And so he comes in and he pulls out this little pistol from his bib overalls, and he said, if they come after me, I'm taking some of them with me. And then he put it back in his overalls. But anyway, that kind of thing, it was all, while you were working, all these other things were happening. So, well, I met Julian, and he was just another worker, just like everybody else. He wasn't all that special. His job was to deal with the press, and so he wrote his press releases. He didn't use this, he did like this. So
he was a two-finger typist?
Yeah, two-finger typist. He was just a wonderful friend. It was like, this Bob Dylan song, I'll be with you till the deal goes down. That's the song I think of when I think about Julian. He's that kind of guy.
Well, can you talk a little bit more about that? That's really interesting.
Yeah, he had
him as just a person.
He had a good sense of humor. And I remember one time at a Snick reunion, there was about 200 of us there, and Julian leans over to me and he says, Margaret, I love all these people, even the ones I don't like. And I used to drive him to the airport because he had speaking engagements all over the country. And so one day, the first time I picked him up, and he got in the back seat. And I thought, well, okay. So, and then I start driving down the road, and I look back, and he's lying down on the back seat. And I said, what's the matter with you? Why are you lying down? And he said, I don't want anybody to see me. And I said, is it because I'm white? And he said, no, people come up to me all the time, and I just don't want them to see me. So he was, and they did,
And this is 1965.
Yeah. So, I could understand that. It's like, leave me alone for a little while kind of thing. He went out in the world.
Who were some of the other people you remember meeting, and how did you sort of fall into your responsibilities there?
Well, like I said, Betty was my mentor, and Jack, of course. But I wanted to go back a little bit about the congressional challenge. After the challenge was over, Jack and Jim Foreman and Lawrence Guillot decided that the papers that I had collected, you know, the affidavits and the testimony, written testimony, weren't safe in the Jackson office because there had been a raid in Louisiana on James Dombrowski, who had records from the SCEF, which was the Southern Conference Educational Fund. And they had raided his office and taken all of his papers. And Jack was afraid the same thing would happen to these affidavits. So they got a trailer and put all these records, these long file cabinets in it, and asked me to drive it to Washington, to the house of Lynn Holt. And so I did that. I had to leave at midnight, and I just drove straight through all night without stopping to get to Lynn's house, and found it and went up, knocked on the front door, and gave him the key, unhitched the trailer, and came back to Mississippi or Atlanta, wherever I was. That was one of the things that I did. It was like, and I didn't think anything of doing that. It was like, sure, I'll do that. It wasn't. So that, you know, I did kind of things like that also. I remember during the time I was there, they moved from Raymond Street to the office, moved to Nelson Street, which is a different building, and the office was much larger. So during the course of the move, Jack and Foreman decided that they didn't trust the people that were moving the records of the office. So they were taken home by some of the staff and then brought back when we got to Raymond Street. That's kind of the way Jack was. But some of those financial records were not returned, and they were recently found in an estate sale and auctioned by an auction house over here in Burlington,
North Carolina.
Yeah. So I went over to look at them it was mostly just receipts from gas stations and a few letters and things like that. You know, there was a note to Ruby Doris Robinson that don't give any more money to Cliff Voss because he just gives it away. So it was like, and people, you know, sending in receipts for gasoline that was 35 cents a gallon, or a hamburger that was 15 cents. You know, it was like all of these old records. And there was a invoice from a bus company that took people from Ohio, from where the training had been for the summer volunteers, to Mississippi. And it just brought back how brave all those people were to do that, to go into Mississippi. Anyway, no, back to the office. I think it was that he saw the big picture. He could see, he understood everything. And this was typical of people that worked in SNCC. They could understand the big picture and their role in it. I think he could relate to people. He saw the irony is what I enjoyed so much. He saw the irony of life.
Any particular examples that you
I'm sorry, I can't give you an example, but that's the main thing that I remember about Julian. I think people trusted him. They trusted him with their personal life, you know, and you could trust him as you could the other people, but he just had this way of looking at you and smiling, and it's like he understood what you were saying. So that just got people to open up. I think that was kind of key.
And do you remember the decision to run him for the Georgia State Legislature?
No, that was after I left.
Okay. Why do you think that Julian was selected? Of all the people that could have run for that seat, why was he part of what became known as the Atlanta Project?
Well, I imagine it's because he was so well known already, and people loved him. So that's what you need to run for office if you're going to be successful. He wasn't just some Joe Blow from off the street. People knew Julian, and they knew his family. He's a well-known person.
And did you follow? He's obviously, when he supports the Snick statement on the war,
right?
And then the Speaker of the Georgia House decides that they're not going to seat Julian Bond.
Right.
You were following this.
Yeah, but only if I was not living in Atlanta. So, where was I? I was either in Washington or Pikeville, Kentucky. So it was like a distance, and we didn't have the internet. But yeah. I was watching it from afar.
Yeah. And did any of this surprise you? One, him running for office and winning.
No.
Then not being seated by the Georgia House.
No, it didn't surprise me at all. Racism. It was a racist decision. Of course, the war had something to do with it, but it was because he was a black man. He was, as he said on his gravestone, he was a race man.
Yeah.
Some other kind of work that I did, I went on some trips across the South to the different projects and visited projects to see how they were doing. And I remember a project in Arkansas, out in the country. I stayed with this family, and the woman owned property in the Delta, which it was in her name, but this white guy was using her land to farm on and not paying her for it. And she wanted to know what we could do about that. And so I mentioned something about the Justice Department, and she said, "Is there any justice in the Justice Department?" So it was like, what do I tell this woman? I don't think there is, but I don't know what else to say. Anyway, that was one trip. On another trip, Jack and Foreman sent me to Selma, Alabama, when King announced that there would be a march in Selma, and the Snick Project thought it was very dangerous to do that, and they didn't want to do it. So Jack sent me to Selma, kind of undercover by myself as a white reporter. I said I was a freelance writer for Parade magazine.
The Sunday insert?
Yeah. So I stayed in this hotel, which has since been torn down, but it was a beautiful hotel with arches that you can see in the movie. It was Carson McCullers' story, which the name I forget. But anyway, so I stayed in that with the other press people, and Douglas Kiker and some other national reporters were there. But anyway, that night, Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot in the back out in a small town away from Selma, and things really heated up. But I went around and talked to the mayor of Selma and the judge and the sheriff as a reporter, and about what was happening. Oh, everything's fine. Our colored are really good people, and they don't cause any trouble. It was all like that. But I could really sense that underneath they were getting ready for something really bad to happen. So I went back to Atlanta and gave them my report and everything. But that was I I saw when I was there, I was walking down the street and Worth Long was coming the other way, and we looked at each other, and I looked away, and he was kind of like, that looks like her. You know, it was
Who
like,
was Worth Long?
he was a Snick person. He was a poet, and he was working in Alabama.
I just want to go back to something you mentioned real briefly that I thought was important. You talked about the Snick Project in Alabama.
At Arkansas.
You referred to a Snick Project. What was this project that you were referring to?
It was like the ones in Mississippi, and Stokely was there at that
voter
time.
registration work.
Voter registration, and they started an organization called Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which is modeled on Alabama state law that Jack searched their constitution, told them how to do it. So they were getting ready to run people for office in the Lowndes County. And there was, I remember back in the office, they were looking at logos for the logo. And Ruth Howard drew a picture of a Black Panther. And I think Dottie had also drawn the same picture somehow. But anyway, they adopted the symbol of the Black Panther on the ballot because the regular Democrat had a white rooster on it. So they, this whole panther that you now see in the Panthers football game is the same thing. That's their logo too. They stole it from Snick.
And I trust there's been no financial compensation.
No financial or recognition, acknowledgement, or whatever. Anyway, so then in 1965, the summer of 65, Malcolm was assassinated, and James Meredith decided that he would walk from Memphis to Jackson. And the projects, this was 65, after the summer of 64, and a lot of people had gone back to their colleges and homes, but he decided he would do that by himself with no organizational backing. So it was like, well, we can't let him be out there by himself, but it's a bad idea, but we're going to support him. And as he was in the Delta, it was when at a meeting in the Delta that Willie Ricks and Stokely Carmichael began talking about Black is beautiful and Black power, about who really has the power in this country. And we can take power away from the ruling class, basically, is what they were talking about. So the idea of Black power, which was very thrilling to me, it was like a wonderful idea, began to take hold. And, it was like they were saying, well, what white people need to do is to go back to their own homes and organize against racism and against the Vietnam War. So that became a new challenge for me and other white people. So in the winter of 65, I left the office of Snick and moved back to Washington for a year. And I supported the idea of Black power and white people working with white people for the future coalition. We had the same goals and the same program, but in the future we would reunite and form a coalition, and then we would take state power, theoretically. So it was a revolutionary idea. It was not a reformist idea, which we had been before, but a revolutionary idea. So I worked at the United Planning Organization in Washington for a year, and I reconnected with Charlene Krantz. She was there, and she was the secretary of Al McSurely, who became my second husband. So in the winter of 66, I had talked to Al a lot about who holds state power and how to take it away from them, and we decided that we would move to we would do that kind of work. So how do you make that decision? Well, you go on a trip across country and you talk to other SNCC organizers who were white and see what they're doing, and then you make a decision about what to do. So we set out in the VW bus in February of 1967, I guess it was, yeah. So we went to Louisville and met Carl and Ann Braden, and they explained about their projects, one in the mountains of Appalachia and one in New Orleans that Bob and Dottie Zeller were working at, and Jack Minnis. So then we went on further west and we met with Mike Miller and Marshall Gantz and a guy named Clint Jinks, who was not a SNCC person. He was an older guy who had been an organizer for a mine mill smelter workers union in Colorado. That was very interesting, the history of that. And we met with Fred Jerome of Progressive Labor Party. And then we came back and we decided that we would work with the Bradens. So we stopped and visited them again, and they said, well, why don't you move to Pikeville, Kentucky and start a project there? So we decided to do that and moved to Pikeville on April Fool's Day of 1967. So after we got there and rented a house, we went to a SNCC staff meeting in Nashville, Tennessee. And Al was working for the Appalachian Volunteers, and I was working for SCEF. So he had a little bit more money than I did. But anyway, we went to Nashville to the staff meeting of SNCC, and Jack and Bob and Dottie and Bob Anilovich and the Bradens and the whole board of SNCC of SCEF. This was a Southern Conference Educational Fund. The whole board was there, and we met in the Methodist building. And the purpose of the meeting was to hear Stokely Carmichael explain about Black Power, what that would mean for SCEF, for white people. And the board was made up of people who taught at white people, a lot of Jewish people who taught at places like Tuskegee and Tougaloo College in Mississippi, and historic black colleges. And some of them had come over after the Second World War or escaped from the Holocaust or were Holocaust survivors. So they kept up their good work. So at that meeting, Stokely came and explained about his vision of Black Power. What that would mean for white people was to go back into the community and organize poor and working white people against racism and against the Vietnam War. So that was an interesting meeting. Not too much, but anyway. And Al and I took a walk during the meeting around the building, and we saw this van, and we heard talking coming from the van, and we realized they were listening to our meeting. They were recording our meeting out in this van, and it was the Nashville police. And actually, they picked Al up for saying that they were looking for a suspect in a bank robbery or something, and they let him go after a while, but they wanted to get his fingerprints and everything. Anyway, we went back to the mountains and stopped at an AV staff meeting, and then we got home, and AV
is what?
Appalachian Volunteers. I didn't say that, did I? But anyway, we got home, and we took the New York Times, but it got there 2 days late. So I was reading the Times, and there was a little article in it that said there had been a riot in Nashville. 2 days after we had left. So didn't think anything of it, but it was there. And that summer, the Peace Corps wanted to do a training in Appalachia, and we had rented this house that was kind of, it had about 4 bedrooms and a barn. So they wanted to use our house to do the training as Peace Corps volunteers and meet some people from Appalachia, a cross-cultural thing. So they came, and there were black Peace Corps and white Peace Corps, and they stayed at our place, and we moved in with friends. And the boys slept in the barn, and the girls slept in the house, and they had their workshops and everything. And then they left, and so then this would have been about July or August. There was an article in the local paper about a Chamber of Commerce meeting where they were talking about outside agitators coming in to organize our poor. So that was kind of like a red flag for me. So we decided to make the friendship of a local lawyer who was a union lawyer. And sure enough, also we decided we needed to get married. So we got married. I was 5 months pregnant, but we went over to Virginia to get married and then came back. But soon after that, the local Commonwealth's attorney and the sheriff came, and the county attorney came and arrested us. I was fixing dinner, and I looked out the window, and I saw these men with guns coming across a field toward our house. And I said, Al, they must be looking for an escaped criminal or something. There's some men outside. And then I heard a knock on the door, and they started coming in the back door. I was in the kitchen. So Al opened the door, and the sheriff comes in, barging into the living room, and he says, "Where's Al McSurely?" And Al's back at the door, and he said, "I'm right here." It was like, so anyway, they come in and they take all of our books and our file cabinets and go through every piece of paper, all of the SNCC address lists and contact lists and position papers, correspondence, and my personal diary and my love letters that I had unfortunately saved up in a box in the back of the closet. And so they arrest Al right away. And then when they found out that I had worked for SNCC, they arrested me also. And they saw, like, we had a movie. It was called Vaya con Dios. And it was one that Clint Jinks had given us about the strike in Colorado, the mine mill smelter workers strike. And so the sheriff's deputy picks up this thing and he says, "Vaya con Dios. That must be from Cuba." It was like, and another one picks up the Village Voice and he says, "Greenwich Village. That's where them beatniks live." It was like, it was so surreal. You couldn't believe that this was happening. And yet it was dangerous at the same time. I just wanted to laugh and cry, cry at the same time. It was amazing. So anyway, they took us and they took all of our papers down to the jail and arrested us for sedition. And then when they put me in the women's cell and I was in the men's cell, and so there we were. Our papers were in the jail cell or somewhere, and I was in there. So the ladies asked me, "Well, what are you in for, honey?" and they could see I was pregnant. And I said, I'm in for sedition. And they just kind of looked at each other, and I realized they didn't know what it meant and that they thought it was soliciting. So I said, sedition means teaching people how to overthrow the government. And they said, well, that's what ought to be done. That's what ought to be. Tell us about it. So we stayed for about a week, and then the Bradens put up their house for our bond, and they came to Pikeville to do that, and then they were arrested for sedition also. So we got out of jail, but our papers were held. And of course, when I was back when I was arrested, I wasn't arrested yet, but I said, I'm pregnant and I need to go to the bathroom. So on the way to the bathroom, the phone rang, and they said, let her pick it up. So I picked it up, and it was this guy, Ron Carver, who I knew from Mississippi. When I was going around collecting affidavits on that trip, Ron worked in Starkville. And I went up to this little hovel of a shack that was the project office, and I heard music coming out of that shack, and it was Vivaldi's Seasons coming out of this shack, this poor place. And so I went in, and Ron was there. So we talked, and it was like listening to this beautiful music. So then he called me just on a whim to see how I was doing and to say hello. And I said, Ron, our house is being raided, and you need to call the Bradens in Louisville and tell them to call the press and to call Bill Kunstler and tell him to get involved in the case. And so he did. He saved our neck. And, it was like a really surreal scene. So when I got in jail, I was with all these ladies, and they were in for things like cursing a police officer, or one was in for attempted murder because she was a Woodbury, and a Woodbury in Pikeville was a dry county, so Woodbury was people who drank Woodbury aftershave lotion. So she was in for attempted murder because one of her friends said she tried to push him down the steps. And so she was arrested right before the grand jury was dismissed for the summer, and she stayed in jail all summer. And the guy didn't show up at the grand jury, so she was let go, but she had to spend the whole summer in jail. I mean, it was like these really, really poor women. And one said, my chickens need to be let out. And so my parents came to see me in jail, so they were helpful and unhelpful. They meant well. They meant well. My mother ordered the jailer to get me a new mattress because she didn't trust the mattresses. It was like, so after she left, I said, well, I'm the new person here who's been here the longest. And Pearl said she'd been here since May, and I said, well, here, take this mattress and let me take yours. So that helped a little bit of the getting over breaking the ice. But anyway, we didn't realize at the time how extensive the government was working to destroy the movement. It was in the highest reaches of government. The FBI, IRS, everybody, and Senate committees were out to destroy whatever we did, to destroy us and whatever we did. And you know about the Messiah Memo from J. Edgar Hoover, the COINTELPRO program, which infiltrated a lot of people, and the political assassinations. we didn't we didn't realize how bad it really was. But Al is writing a book. He's done a lot of research about that, so people are interested. That he has all the data. I can't explain it all, but he has all of that. So
You're
people,
referring to your ex-husband?
yeah, Al McSurely, yeah. So after we got out, about a month later, a man came knocking at the door, and it was short, and he was very flushed, and he said, "Are you Margaret McSurely?" And I said, "Yes." And so he said, "I'm Mr. Brick. I'm from the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and I have a subpoena for you." And I said, "Well, come in, Mr. Brick." So he came in and he gave his subpoenas. And I said, "Mr. Brick, are you related to Mrs. Brick that works for Dr. McKenzie?" And he said, "Yes, she's my wife." Now, Dr. McKenzie was my therapist when I was in Washington, and I had an affair with Pearson, So, and I thought, well, this is strange, me being in love with an old man like this. So I went in for therapy, and Mrs. Brick was the secretary. So here, this guy, an investigator, comes with a subpoena for us and for our papers. There are 235 documents that Senator McClellan wants. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations was a rename of the old Joe McCarthy Committee, and they were out to destroy whatever we did by different means, different methods. Anyway, so he left, and we called our lawyer immediately and told him what had happened. And they went to the Supreme Court of the United States to get this subpoena squashed. So the subpoena gets squashed, and we stay there through the winter into 1968. And that's when Martin Luther King was assassinated. But he had started the Poor People's Campaign, which was a call for poor people to come to Washington to lobby and to have demonstrations. And the government was very frightened of this. But so Al worked to get people to the Poor People's Camp. Meanwhile, I had the baby, and I stayed at home in Pikeville a lot. And we were also working with coal miners who had black lung. And then in the fall, we got our papers back because the government had the right to keep them for a year for appeal after the subpoena was squashed. And there were many hearings that I had to go to in Cincinnati and other places into federal court. What happened with the sedition arrest is that our lawyers moved the case from state court to federal court because you can't overthrow the Commonwealth of Kentucky without overthrowing all the states. So it was a federal case. They did this based on the Dombrowski case. Remember, I talked about that in Louisiana. So the Dombrowski case set the precedent to get our case to federal court. So then their time was up, and we went to the courthouse to get our papers. And Mr. Brick was there again with another subpoena. And he had the 236 documents that he went through with Al. And they were all of my love letters and my diary and, letters from Pearson and position papers, address lists of SNCC and SCEF and contacts, all of those things. And so we got them back. But we were very afraid that something of what was going to happen next. I was horrified because I knew I could die for what I believed in, but I didn't think it was right for the baby to die. So that was what scared me the most all year. I was frightened for the baby, for Victor. His name is Victor, named after the great victory of the people. So anyway, a month after we got the papers back, when we were going through them again, I saw what they had of mine. I knew I could never let that be seen again by anyone outside, and we decided to burn the papers, burn everything. We said, well, should we call the lawyers? And then no, because they'd say it was destroying evidence. It's best that they not know. So, so we went out and burned all that stuff up. And then we had the subpoena to come to Washington, and it got postponed and postponed. And we went up there, and so on the way to the hearing, Kunstler was there, and he had his briefcase. And we were riding together in a taxi, and he's opened up his briefcase, and there were 2 joints in there. And I said, Bill, you shouldn't be carrying this pot around with you. And he said, oh, well, if the cops stop me, I'll just say it's evidence. So it was like this bizarre thing. So on the way to the courthouse with Bill Kunstler and the pot, 2 joints, we stop at the courthouse. We're on the way to the Capitol. We stop at the courthouse to file a lawsuit against the committee for violating our Fourth Amendment rights, because they had taken our papers without our permission. So we get to the hearing, and they closed it. It was executive session, but we had about 200 friends in the hallway trying to get in. And we told them that we would not give them anything, but we would give them a copy of the brief of our lawsuit, which said that they had violated our constitutional rights. And so the reason that we filed it on the way to the courthouse was so that it wouldn't get dismissed before the hearing. So that was Kunstler's idea. He was so full of chutzpah. So that's how that case started. And then there was a big delay of whether to have we were held in contempt of Congress. And so that was a criminal case again. And then we had a civil case against the committee. So there was a big thing back and forth about which case would come first. And they decided to have the criminal case first. Well, so we had a jury trial on that. But the judge would not let the jury hear any of the circumstances of why we got the subpoenas or how we got the subpoenas, just whether or not we turned the documents over. So we were convicted of contempt of Congress, but we won on appeal in the Court of Appeals. So then the question of our our civil case against the committee, and that took a long time to decide. Meanwhile, Kunstler was pulled to Chicago for the Chicago 7 case, Abby Hoffman and Dave Dillinger and Bobby Seale. And then we got a lawyer who was actually better, a lawyer named Morty Stavis. And he did his homework very thoroughly. We had a jury trial, and we won a judgment. So we won that case. And I was able to go back to college. That's why I went to American University and got my bachelor's and master's. And by that time, Al and I had gotten a divorce, and he got married again, and he went to law school. So he became a civil rights lawyer. And I'm here in Carborough, North Carolina, still in the movement.